Hi. I'm going to do two videos on feminist and ecofeminist takes on class society. The first one's going to be a sort of broad overview where I look at, the analysis as a whole and examples from history and current society. But the second video is going to be more about more detailed examples from recent times. To show how this general analysis can sort of fit in and help us to understand what's going on at the moment in environmental politics. So I'm going to be gathering up some points that I've made in earlier talks and linking them together, adding extra info and research examples and insights and so on. So the first proposition, which I'm going to advance, is that class society has a psychic base in patriarchy, that in a sense, class society depends on patriarchy. Patriarchy is certainly not an outcome of class society, it's rather the other way around. The second point I want to make is that class societies have a troubled relationship with non-human nature. I don't think, and I'll explain later, that I don't think all class societies are on a, hell-bent on destroying the natural world and have achieved that. But at the same time, there's no doubt that compared to classless hunting and gathering or horticultural societies, class societies are much more likely to run into trouble of that type. This troubled relationship with non-human nature is often expressed through a discourse that links women to nature in class societies, denigrating both, that women are more natural than men, and that both the nature and women are to be controlled by men, and what comes out of this in class societies is three allied dualisms, if you like, that men in relationship to women, the elite or the ruling class in relationship to subordinate class and enemy, populations and so on, the human world and civilization as opposed to the natural non-human, uncivilized or wild or whatever. This analysis is based on a number of wonderful books and writings by ecofeminists of various kinds, and as you'll see, if you delve into these more, or if you have looked at these before, my own analysis draws on this, but it's not quite the same. So obviously, Wilhelm Reich, a 1930s communist psychoanalyst, radical psychoanalyst, has been influential. Shulamith Firestone takes up some themes from that, and she's certainly influential in what I'm going to talk about. She's an early second wave feminist. Val Plumwood, moving right along and writing in the 90s, Feminism and the Mastery of Nature, an Australian ecofeminist philosopher. Nancy Chodorow, an anthropologist and psychologist. Brilliant analysis that I've talked about before. Ariel Soleil, still going strong, and author of a number of books related to ecofeminism. Carolyn Merchant, Sylvia Federici, who's very popular at the moment. Maria Mies, part of the sort of post-second wave ecofeminist movement in its founding days. Of Vandana Shiva, the same, an Indian writer. Collard and Contrucci, who I refer to, like a sort of separatist ecofeminist position. And Deborah Bird Rose, an American anthropologist who's worked with Indigenous people in Australia. These have all been influential in the sort of things I'm going to be talking about. So my first question is patriarchy natural? Okay, so I have been saying in these videos that there's neither a yes or a no answer to that. That the patriarchy is both socially constructed and also relies on natural differences between the sexes. Does this make patriarchy natural in the sense of given and inevitable? No, it doesn't actually. It means that we need to attend to both these natural material elements of sexual difference and biological difference, and also to the social construction of gender, if we were to understand and hopefully to eliminate patriarchy. So all right, now I'm getting into this topic in more detail. How is patriarchy in fact socially constructed? Well, the first point that I want to make is that patriarchy is cross-cultural and trans-historical, and basically, as far there's no social type, like hunting and gathering, which escapes, or or horticultural or whatever, which escapes patriarchy. That I wouldn't say it's absolutely 100% universal. I don't think we really know the answer to that question, but it's certainly pretty well. It involves the exploitation and domination of women by men, which I've talked about in previous talks, and it depends upon men's political advantage in power conflicts with women, and the political advantage that men have, and which is coming out of the second wave feminist movement like Shulamith Firestone and so on. Men are not hampered by pregnancy, wet nursing, or strong emotional ties to infants coming out of those experiences. So all of these things mean that men are free to develop political control in societies and have much more freedom than women. But it's also a political choice by men. You can talk about men, as Firestone does, as a sex class, and they make a political choice to take advantage of those differences. It's not inevitable in the sense that they might make a different choice. An interesting thing, if we're looking at other related species to human beings, the bonobos, which are a kind of chimpanzee, and like we're fairly similar to them. They're not patriarchal, like the standard chimps. They're pretty patriarchal, and so are gorillas and orangutans and so on, but not the bonobos. And it may well be that we're more closely related to the bonobos than to the chimps. And so it's possible that patriarchy is a cultural invention. We could set it back to 80,000 years and say it was invented at the same time as, some of the early artworks that we've discovered for human societies. And there's no way to contradict that. Like, the archaeological evidence is moot on that point. So it's always possible. It seems unlikely to me, but then again, you never know. And it's certainly not, patriarchy is certainly not inevitable now at the present time. I mean, if we talk about the sort of structural forces which originated and still maintain patriarchy based on women's role in reproduction and birth, these are obviously very much subject to various kinds of technological intervention, which we can manage now. And given a feminist movement which is prepared to run with it, to run with the politics of it, we can certainly avoid patriarchy. So I'm thinking of things like the low birth rate, because there's a low death rate. So why have lots of children? And so we certainly don't need that in this on the planet at the moment. Low infant mortality, so women don't have to have lots of children to replace some that die, and so on. The technologies of contraception and abortion, which we have at the present time, and I mean, I'd argue and have in earlier talks that the first and the second wave feminist movement are not unrelated to this. Certainly that's not the only thing that's going on that's caused those feminist movements to happen, but they do coincide with some of these changes that I've just mentioned. All right, so now I'm going back to this question. So what are the sort of cultural impacts of patriarchy that play out in various kinds of social orders? Apart from the obvious ones that we could talk about in terms of gender inequality and so on, but more broadly, how does this affect things? Well, first of all, I want to talk about the impact in terms of what you could call leaders and followers, the predisposition of human beings in patriarchal societies to set up those kind of relationships of leaders and followers. And what I would argue is that these relationships are based on the model of hierarchy in the family, with the father, if you like, as head of the family. Even in extended kinship network, these are sort of allied brothers or fathers and sons and so on, set up a sort of leadership in the family vis-a-vis the women in that family. And so the leading male in this situation becomes like the boss of the family. and this leads to an expectation of roles of subordination and domination in social relationships. Okay, so that's the first cultural impact, which I'll call leaders and followers. The second cultural impact is what I'll call anxious competitive masculinity. I've talked extensively about this in earlier talks. So it's premised on the fact that in a patriarchal society, men avoid the entanglements, the political downside, if you like, the restrictions, the constraints of being involved in early childcare, in the care of infants who are massively dependent on being looked after in various ways. And that for boys growing up, what this means is that men are sort of distant figures who they don't interact with. Obviously they do to a certain extent, and this varies from one society to another, but they don't have the same sort of experience of nurturing and constant care that they get from the women in their lives. So men are slightly different, distant species, if you like. And women are the role models for little boys of adult humanity, what it is to be an adult human. That's who they identify with. This is Nancy Chodoro's theory, and I absolutely endorse it. And then a distant and not intimately known. So how does this play out? So these boys then are at a certain age, and like this varies again, and it's also related to various ceremonies like initiation and so on, are urged to become men. And the way that they're offered as to how to do this is to separate themselves from women, to distance themselves from the nurturing aspects of women's behaviour that they've experienced as infants, and become tough and kind of competitive and show that they're real men by beating other men. They compete with other men and dominate women. So what I'd be arguing is that in all patriarchal societies, which basically means in all societies that have existed, these patterns, these psychic patterns are important. However, in classless societies, these psychic patterns don't lead to and leads to class, to inequality as we understand it. So the domination. Let's talk about classless societies, and we could call them indigenous, or anthropologically, you could call them hunting and gathering, or horticultural, or whatever, different types of classless society. This domination submission pattern operates to inform leadership roles in politics, ritual, spiritual power, war, and art. So it doesn't like in these egalitarian societies, it doesn't go away in the sense that there are leading men who become influential. In a lot of horticultural societies, there are hereditary chiefs. There are also war chiefs who are good at military raids and so on, and take leadership roles in a conflict situation. But on the other hand, this leadership is kept in check by an egalitarian political arrangement in classless societies. There's no means of control. There's no way of controlling people and getting leverage over people by controlling their means of subsistence. Everyone owns their own garden. They go out into the forest to hunt. There's no kind of ownership of the material resources that you need to live, and there's no kind of leverage like there is in class societies over that. So the result of that is that leadership shifts. It depends upon personal qualities of particular men who develop leadership roles, and it's also present amongst the women in those classless societies too. And competitive masculinity, which I've just talked about, is expressed in classless societies in things like hostile raids on other villages, where men go out in the middle of the night and arrive at another village at dawn and kill people and take their heads back home. I mean, unfortunately quite typical of horticultural societies. In feuds, like in indigenous, in hunting and gathering societies, based on witchcraft, like cursing people or fearing a curse and cursing them back preemptively, these kind of things. In cultural leadership, like being the inventor of receiving a dreaming, which leads to a whole new ceremony, that kind of thing. So this kind of competitive masculinity is expressed through struggles for leadership in these kind of arenas without actually leading to a permanent stratified unequal society with different material resources in different strata. Okay, so that's what a classless society is like. So leaders influence, but they cannot command people to do anything. Okay, so now let's look at class societies. So I'm going to first of all give a brief account, following what I've said before, of the invention, the origins of class societies. Class societies are an invention of the human species. They clearly were not around before about 8,000 BC or something like that. So my guess as to how they were set up, which is informed by the literature, of course, is that cultural leaders kind of came out of the society and managed tribute for ceremonies. So as I've said, sites like Göbekli or whatever it's called in Turkey are classic of situations like this, or Stonehenge or whatever, where people would come together in big groups and have some kind of spiritual ceremony. We don't know exactly what. And my guess is that what happened is that they expected the priests, if you like, the ruling, not the ruling elite, but the influential elite of village leaders, would expect people to provide them with gifts to make the ceremony work, and that it would you could call that tribute, if you like. And they suddenly, to invent class, what they did was start to use some of that tribute to pay an armed force to subdue anybody who was a bit recalcitrant, and that gradually transformed into a class society. And as I've said before, that was only possible with a storable surplus of cereals and the entrapment of populations in irrigation, agricultural river systems. So people couldn't just, when they got pissed off with this situation, they couldn't just leave and go somewhere else, because what they were surrounded by would be desert, like I say, there's not much future in that. So class spreads from these secure bases through conquest and imitation. So other surrounding societies realize that they have to develop an army and a ruling class, and all of these structures in order to defeat the nearby state that's just been set up, and so on, or the nearby state conquers them and takes over and turns them into peasants, slaves, whatever. All right, now what I'm now going to say is, now I'm going to join these links together. I mean, this has been a long preliminary, but necessary. So how patriarchy informs class society. As I said, I'm taking patriarchy as a causal necessity for class society. It's something that's one of the basis of class society, just as much as cereal agriculture and irrigation and so on is. Okay, so domination in the family is a pattern for relationships between rulers and subordinates in class society. The king, or the ruling class taken as a whole, like the nobility, become like the fathers of society. The obedience, like to your own father, is treated as a duty. The fathers are both feared, because they're dangerous and so on, and also revered, respected and so on. And they're seen as sort of figures who are both scary but also kind of protect you, and they look after you and so on. This is exactly the psychological metaphor on which class society itself is based, just like authority in the family. So what does this mean is that the subordinate class, the peasants, the slaves, the people who actually do the agricultural work and so on, are being treated as women, as though they were women or children. They're to be exploited and controlled, just like women are exploited, And the second thing, so the second pillar, the cultural pillar, if you like, of class societies, is the competitive masculinity that I've explained before, as typical of patriarchies. The ruling class, subordinates the army. In other words, they're competitive and they take control. In the competition, they win, and the army is subordinate, right? The army has the same relationship to the peasants. They take control and they win vis-a-vis the peasants. The samurai of ancient Japan with their swords cutting off the heads of recalcitrant peasants, and the Spartan citizen ruling class, like killing the helots as a sort of initiation rite. Anyway, the nation and the nation as a whole subordinates its enemies, so they're treated as you know, like as the competition which has to be controlled and dominated over. In all of this, the subordinates are given the role of dominated women, you know, like this is so universal as not to be a comment, you know, in other words, that the enemies who are defeated are in the role, are just like playing like girls, you know, like that's a comment that you use in football, and like it cuts across all of these examples in a way. The rulers of class societies portray themselves as kind of removed from material everyday concerns. They're not bothered by where their next meal is coming from, or you know, and they're not greedy and materialistic. No, they're pure, they're spiritual, they're rational compared to the irrational, wild, natural, and materialistic lower classes and women. You know, like, okay. So the detachment that men experience in the family growing up from women and from their mothers and adult women and so on is reconfigured in class societies as detachment from subordinated classes and enemies. You have no sympathy for these people. You know, as a member of the armed forces, you know, a soldier in ancient Egypt, or as a pharaoh or whatever, you don't really care about these people at all. That's really obvious from the history. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about where the natural world comes into all of this, the non-human, to be precise, natural world. In classless societies, okay, so let's first of all look at how they operate in terms of that. Well, classless societies adapt to the non-human natural world. You know, they acknowledge their dependence on nature. For example, Indigenous people in Australia have rituals of renewal in which they the ritual invites a particular species, non-human natural species, you know, like hakea nuts, or, you know, what are they called? Yeah, bunya nuts or something like that, to increase, and flying foxes or whatever, and to grow strong and have more and like next year and this kind of thing. And the ceremony is all about that. So what that's doing is acknowledging and making a really clear statement that we depend upon these natural species to do well. They have religions in which human and not the distinction between human and non-human nature is blurred. For example, they might have animal or plant ancestors who were the founders of their clan, and in the narratives which explain this, these plant ancestors are treated as though they're human people, you know, and the same with you know, elements of the geophysical world like rainbows and thunderstorms and so on, mountains, whatever. So there's not. I mean, I think it would be completely wrong to think that they don't make a distinction between human and non-human nature, but at the same time, there are various ways in which they blur this distinction in their religious worldview. So the totems that are animals and behave as humans, like say with the North American Indians, and they kill an animal for food, they thank the spirit ancestors of the animal for this, and this is quite a common thing around the world in other indigenous cultures. So human culture, in other words, the sort of patterns of human behavior, the rules of marriage, and all of these things are treated as analogous to the kind of behavioral patterns of other species, you know, like so the jabiru, you know, a kind of crane in Australia that has a particular dance, and a mating dance and so on. And that dance, I mean, from the Indigenous perspective, that dance is no different to the kind of dances that in the Indigenous context that they as humans perform. And like, you know, so this is our culture and that's their culture. So there's no, so again, what we're getting is a blurring of that distinction. And they have technologies that are in fact sustainable, you know, like population control through wet nursing to 4 years, like using tree crops that are not destroying the soil in the horticultural societies, you know, like bananas or, you know, olives or hazelnuts, chestnuts, whatever. They use slash and burn agriculture in horticultural societies where they take 20 years to come back to a site they've used before and so on. They hunt or forage over large areas and don't kill too many of the same species, or they replant the top of the sweet potato that they've dug up or whatever. All of these things, there's technologies which have evolved, if you like, in indigenous cultures, which end up by allowing a sustainable traditional economy to be maintained indefinitely, over long thousands of years, whatever. And what we can also say about this situation is that there's no gender division in terms of relationship to the natural world. What I mean by that is that, yeah, maybe that men have particular expected relationships to particular parts of the natural world, like it could be kangaroos or, and women might have a relationship to another part of it, like emus or whatever. I mean, but it's like both sexes have these kind of ties, if you like, to particular parts of the natural world. There's no overall tie, or division like this, men are separate from nature and women are close to nature, like you get in class societies. That's not how it works. And so the idea that it's always been the case that women are closer to nature because of reproduction just doesn't actually fit the anthropology. And there's a wonderful book on that by Strathern and others, an edited collection. All right, what I've been looking at is the sort of relationship to the natural world of classless societies. Now I want to look at the environmental psychology, if you like, of class societies. So the first thing you can say about that is, like, as I've said before, cereal agriculture is like the mainstay of class societies because it's a storable surplus that a ruling class can take up and sort of maintain control of. They put it in a barn and then dole it out to particular people, depending on how they want to run things. And all class societies have depended on one kind of cereal agriculture or another, like maize in the Americas and rice in China and so on. So what we could say about this kind of cereal agriculture is, like, it's pretty well monocropping, although sometimes there are companion crops in with the cereals. But it involves ploughing and destroys a whole natural area. So you can think of a rainforest which has been turned into a set of rice terraces. Well, where's the rainforest now? Obviously it's not there any longer. The same thing with a field of wheat or maize, for that matter. And in the context of that kind of cereal agriculture, it's quite common to treat wild species as an enemy to be excluded with violence by clearing, ploughing, or weeding, and so on. And species like particular kinds of insects like locusts or whatever are clearly an enemy, in the sense that they can wipe out a whole crop and starve vast numbers of people. The second reason, if you like, why class societies in general and not in any particular period of history, whatever, have a tendency to destroy their environments is because of their political structure. They're centralized around a city, and people, horses or people on foot. The army can only travel so far away from the city. They depend upon high density populations to mean that they can support a large army. Then that can take control over the surrounding areas or defeat rival states and so on. And the ruling class is scared that they're going to be overthrown by a palace coup and so on. So they want to increase the number of peasants, the amount of food, and the size of their army, and I mean, they're a social machine in the sense that they're based upon particular mythologies and kind of ideas about how society should be run that kind of are very hard to shift, because the whole of the society is like a machine in the sense that all of the parts are integrated and kind of work with each other and and consequently class societies have a tendency to expand and overuse the natural environment on which they depend. Now, what I'd say about that, yeah, I'll come back to that. They don't, yeah. Anyway, so these are two ways in a sense in which class societies are kind of almost predisposed to treat the natural world badly. And what they also do is they create a metaphor in which women and subordinate classes are seen as a natural unruly elements to be tamed. You know, so just like a plague of locusts can kill off your whole wheat field, it's a wild, unruly element, da, da, da. So they treat the lower classes in the same sense. They're a wild, unruly element that if they get out of hand, they can destroy society. The same with women. If they don't keep in their proper place and behave properly, and who knows what they might do, you know, like, so it's like, so one way to see that is to say that nature is itself feminized. It's seen as like a force. Nature is a force to be dominated, the way, like, so similarly to the way in which women are in patriarchal society. There's a psychological dissociation. That's a word that Aristotle uses for this, based on Freud and so on. But between the ruling elites and the natural world, you know, and like this dissociation is based on the prior dissociation between men and women. It's like psychologically depends on that. So there's a patriarchal construction of nature in most class societies. Let's say women are closer to nature, masculinity is control over nature, and this is a discourse of dualism, you know, like but you know, humans and nature, two things, right? Men and women, two things, like joined up. Okay, so the way that Val Plummer puts this is to say that gender is linked up to other dualisms. So the gender dualism of men and women is linked to the dualism of reason versus emotion. Or detachment in men versus instinct, or civilized versus primitive, or, you know, like master and slave, culture and nature. So these dualisms are kind of linked together, and psychologically, the first one, the one that informs the others, if you like, is the patriarchal gender division. So looking at how this has worked out in history, there's a history of collapse with class societies that overuse their environments to the point of collapse. And capitalism is just the most recent example of this tendency. So we can look at Mesopotamia, where irrigation agriculture brought a lot of salt to the surface of the soil and destroyed it. The Indus Valley, another early civilization, same kind of problem. Rome, where they overexploited the wheat fields of Egypt and North Africa to completely destroy the environment in those places, and leading to a sort of problem how to source enough wheat to maintain an army to fight off the barbarians from the north and so on. The Cahokia in the Mississippi Valley built huge sort of forts, you know, out of a palisade of posts stuck in the ground, and this deforested the surrounding area, meaning soils got washed away, and you know, they ended up by having a collapse. The Anasazi, same problem. They inhabited a fairly arid area. This is in New Mexico, I think it is. And they basically burned, used in their housing construction, but also for fires. They burnt all the surrounding wood. Again, problems of soil erosion and environmental agricultural collapse. The Mayan society, which there were a number of things, but one of them was the huge pyramids, which were required to impress you know, other states and the local peasant population with the power of the ruling elites. They were plastered with lime, and that lime was created by burning kilns full of wood, you know. So what they did was they cut all the forests on the sort of hillsides surrounding their fields, and then there was huge erosion, and all of this really terrible topsoil from the hills came and filled up the valleys, so that you know their maize crops really went to pieces. I mean, that took a long time, but still. Angkor in Cambodia, an amazing civilization, huge, yeah. And I mean, like, that was all based upon irrigation and rice agriculture. And as the climate changed and various other things, they weren't able to maintain it, and people starved and so on. So the psychology of patriarchy and in relationship to nature is not the only cause of these collapses. Obviously, it's a contributing factor. And again, you have to say that not all class societies led to that kind of agricultural collapse and population disaster and so on. So ancient China, Japan, Bali, and Indonesia generally, and parts of India, which were based on irrigation, rice irrigation states based on that, seem to have survived a lot better because the dominant form was agriculture, was fairly sustainable compared to, say, wheat growing, in the Mesopotamian basin or in North Africa, whatever. Despite these differences, there's a common thread in a lot of class societies: the psychology of patriarchy, the culture of class domination, and the separation from nature. So I just want to look at a couple of examples of this from the ancient world before moving on a bit. Where are we up to? I'm trying to work out how long I've been recording for, but anyway, I'm thinking it's close to half an hour. So the first one I want to look at is the Legend of Gilgamesh. This legend it's like one of the first poems ever. I can't be sure of the date now. I think it's like 3000 BC or 4000 BC, something like that. It's amazing. Anyway, Uruk is a city in question, and the myth is a kind of religious founding myth of the city. Gilgamesh is the king of Uruk. He's renowned for his aggressive, nasty competitiveness and his huge sexual appetite. Anyway, a goddess called Arunu creates another god called Enkidu to restrain Gilgamesh, stop him from behaving so badly. Now, this is really interesting. So then they characterize Enkidu in very feminine terms and link him to the natural world. Like, okay, so Enkidu, even though it's a man, of course, has long hair like a woman, right? Eats grass, like vegan, early vegan, and lives in the wild with gazelles, like they're Enkidu's friends, the gazelles. Can really understand that. They're very pretty. Anyway, Gilgamesh persuades Enkidu to rape a priestess, to eat animal flesh and drink alcohol. So these are all symbols of the domination of both of women who were there like in the early religion, which this myth is describing, the prior religion before the founding of the city, or at the same time as the founding of the city or whatever. The priestess, and eat animal flesh, meaning dominated nature in no uncertain fashion, and drinking alcohol, which leads, to aggression and uncontrolled violence and sexuality and so on. And so Enkidu is persuaded by this evil king Gilgamesh, and he becomes a close friend of Gilgamesh. So to show his loyalty to Gilgamesh, he does a number of acts which are kind of characteristic of how this competitive patriarchal behavior is understood. He kills the sacred cedar tree. Okay, so like in the old religion that they're talking about, like there's a sacred cedar tree, like representing humans' relationship to the natural world. Well, in his new kind of alliance with Gilgamesh, Enkidu kills the sacred cedar tree, and he kills the guardian of the forest. Like, okay, so he insults the goddess Ishtar. Female, like obviously who's the one whose goddess role is to protect the natural world. Well, he insults her. So this, I think what you can see in this, I mean, I don't read this as a sort of an accurate description of an original matriarchal religion that's being overthrown at all. I read this as like a self-understanding of patriarchal class society. This is how patriarchal class society understands itself. Masculine power is control over women and nature and the lower classes and so on, and through aggression, like we've talked about, and the separation and dissociation from the natural world and from women. All right, so thousands of years after that, like Aristotle, like I think it'd have to be minus 200 BC or minus 100 BC. There was a tutor to Alexander the Great, so I'm not sure, but something like that, minus 200 or minus 250 or whatever. And Aristotle writes this. So he's the last of the three famous Greek philosophers. Each one influenced the other: Socrates, Plato, and then Aristotle. Right. So he was a tutor to it. Yeah, I said that anyway. So this is in one of his most famous books, and what he says is, it is clear that the rule of the soul over the body, like the rational soul, the sort of spiritual part of humanity over the body, the material, terrible kind of yucky, fleshy stuff, and of the mind, the rule of the soul over the body, and of the mind and the rational element over the passionate. So he makes this separation between emotions, which are evil and material and kind of like gross, whatever, if you like, and rational, like clear-headed, is natural and expedient. So this is the way things should be. That means it's natural, and expedient meaning this is the best way to go. Whereas the equality of the two, or the rule of the inferior, meaning the rule of the passions over the mind or whatever, or the body over the soul, is in the rule of the inferior is always hurtful. So you should never be carried away by those evil bodily passions. You should always keep them under stern control through the intellect and the pure soul, the spiritual part. And now he makes these obvious analogies that I've been talking about. The same holds good for animals in relationship to men, to humans, in other words. He's saying that for tame animals have a better nature than wild. Yeah. And all tame animals are better off when they are ruled by man. So it's actually for their own good, So, the cow probably doesn't think that as it's being bonked on the head. But anyway, again, the male is by nature superior and the female inferior, and the one rules and the other is ruled. So he makes this discursive link. It's really obvious. It makes this link between the inequality between men and women, the inequality between humans and nature, and the rule of the rational over the uncivilized, the natural, emotional, whatever. We also find this in other class societies. For example, in India, we have the high caste, which is really pure, and the Brahmins who are ultra pure, if you like, and then the low caste, the untouchables, and they're polluted because they do nasty material work related to the body and so on. In Bali, we have the evil goddess Rangda, who's symbolized and connected to the vast fig trees and so on, versus the pure spiritual hero Krishna and so on. In English mythology, we have St. George suppressing the dragon and killing the dragon. The knight in armor comes around and kills the natural evil monster from the Black Lagoon. So I'm not saying this was necessarily true of all class societies, this kind of mythological division, but or that's the only kind of thing that's going on. but it's a theme. Let's say that at least that. And clear, I mean, and some people, some ecofeminists, like say Carolyn Merchant, for example, basically sees capitalism and Bacon and so on, early sciences, as developing this theme of women being closer to nature and men controlling the natural world like they control women and so on, as a development of capitalist society. And I'm saying no, it actually goes a long way back further than that. But it's certainly true of capitalist societies. And I want to say that it's a theme, a discourse, available popular discourse of the relationship between humans and the natural world that informs kind of popular media at the present time. Not all popular media, but certainly some of it. For example, two films I want to mention: Bambi, which was like massively popular as an early Disney cartoon, which is about hunters killing Bambi's mother, and Bambi weeps. So what and like this was marketed as a film for mothers and children to go and see, and it's like when I took my students once to look at a permaculture guy who had a cage in which he had these huge pigeons that he was going to eat, and the members of the class were just horrified that he was going to do this, and he said, yeah, that's the Bambi view of nature. Like, okay, so it's become legendary, if you like. It's the feminine way of looking at the natural world, having empathy for natural creatures and wanting to look after them and feeling affinity and friendship to the natural world and so on. And then a more recent film, which is probably not that recent now, but anyway, I certainly remember it quite well, is Babe. Like, oh my God, wonderful film. But it's like, yeah, but I mean, it's all about the exploitation of pigs, really, by humans. And Babe is this pig who turns into a sheep. I mean, learns how to be like a sheepdog, and the crusty old farmer, develops this affection for Babe finally, and becomes more feminine and affectionate, and looks after Babe, and is excited and emotionally connected to this baby pig. And I could go on about Babe for hours, but anyway, again, it's a film that markets the idea that the feminine way of relating to nature is to have alliance and closeness to nature and so on, and the default masculine position is to control nature. And it's in the film, it's represented through the two sheepdogs, the male and the female sheepdog. The female sheepdog loves Babe and is very affectionate to Babe, and the masculine sheepdog thinks Babe should never be allowed to round up sheep because that's only a sheepdog's role. See, there you go. And what we also find in terms of technologies, there are a whole set of technologies that are not considered to be women's business, if you like, in late capitalist societies, especially in the West, and even more so in Anglo-Celtic countries, which is all those tools that control nature through using vast amounts of power through controlling nature, like cars, for example. I mean, clearly women drive in now, but I mean, like it took a while. But also the muscle car is like an expression of masculinity, the powerful car, But also things like bulldozers and the huge trucks and so on, guns and chainsaws and so on, are all regarded as masculine prerogative. I mean, I love the Alaskans programs because they show women using chainsaws all the time and shooting animals. It's very interesting. And women are associated with all of those technologies that are not part of that, like the house, babies, like things to do with babies, pets, and so on. So now that's the end of the first talk on this topic. In the next talk, I'm going to talk about examples for research from the Hunter region, which kind of relate to this discourse and explain how it can be manifest, if you like, in current society, and try and tease out what are the implications for the environmentalist movement in how to make use of this discursive construction, or kind of oppose it, or what to do with it, really. Okay, thanks.